All right, we are at the top of the hour, so we're going to go on and get started today. I first would like to thank everyone for taking some time out of your busy schedules to join us for this webinar. Today we will be covering requirement 11 of the PCI Data Security Standard, regularly test security systems and processes. So just a few housekeeping things before we dive into the requirements. This session is being recorded, and all attendees will be receiving a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slide deck following the presentation. Additionally, everyone will remain muted throughout the session, but we highly encourage you to ask any questions that you have using the Q&A feature, which is located on the top of the WebEx toolbar. And I will be monitoring those throughout this presentation, and we will have some time reserved at the end to answer any of those. Just to give you a little bit of background about Kirkpatrick Price, Kirkpatrick Price is a PCI qualified security assessor and licensed CPA firm providing assurance services to clients worldwide. The firm has over 11 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. And we offer both regulatory compliance and information security services, and we provide consulting services such as policy and procedure drafting, risk assessment, internal audit plan and development, and readiness audits. And we also provide guidance and audit services on frameworks such as PCI DSS, SSA 16, SOC 2, FISMA, HIPAA, and ISO 27001, 27002. So I wanted to take another quick minute before I hand it over to Jeff to invite you to connect with us. You can subscribe to our blog for regular industry updates, tips, and best practices. We post on there regularly, and we always have some really great content that we get submitted on there. And we also keep a library of our recorded webinars, which is located on our website. So in case there's a requirement that you missed or another subject that we have presented a webinar on, that will all be located there. And LinkedIn is another great way to stay in touch with us and another way to stay in the loop with what's going on in your industry. So at this time, I would like to welcome Jeff Wilder. Jeff has over 15 years of experience in information security, and prior to joining Kirkpatrick Price, Jeff was a trainer for the PCI Security Standards Council, where he was responsible for educating individuals working towards becoming qualified security assessors. And in his current role of Director of PCI Services at Kirkpatrick Price, Jeff is responsible for all aspects of PCI services. Jeff holds several industry certifications. As you see there, he is a CISSP, an ISSAP, ISSNP, and a CISA. So at this time, I'd like to welcome you, Jeff.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I also want to thank everybody for spending part of your lunch hour or this time of the day with us. Today we have a really great presentation. We're going to talk about the Vulnerability Management, Vulnerability Identification Program. Today we shouldn't run the full hour, but nevertheless it's going to be really great content. So if I can go ahead and get you to move forward for us, sir. All right. So for those of you that are not intimately familiar with the PCI DSS, effectively the PCI DSS was, or the PCI security standards was developed for the card brands to help organizations such as yourself kind of manage the security of the data that they might have custody of, right? So it's a global standard, and it really is looking for the organizations to apply these standards as a minimum baseline in order to help to protect the security of those environments, okay? So if I can go ahead and get you to move forward. So PCI DSS applies to any organization, any merchant, any service provider that stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data, or would have the ability to store, process, transmit, or even perhaps maybe impact the security of somebody else's cardholder data. So if you have any exposure to cardholder data, the standards and the requirements that we're going to be talking about and have been talking about for some time now absolutely apply to you, okay? So let's go ahead and move forward. So right now with version 3.1, there's currently 394 controls if you're just doing a vanilla assessment. There's still 6 control objectives, and there's 12 subject areas. Version 3.2 has been out for some time, and as soon as we're finished presenting the last bit for 3.1, we're going to probably start over with 3.2, and there's somewhere around the 420, 430 controls that are associated with the next version of the PCI DSS. Okay, let's go and move forward. So far, we've addressed requirements 1 through 10. Last couple weeks ago, we presented a really great session on log management, and now we get to requirement 11. And requirement 11 is basically testing the security systems and processes that you have. And I want to spend a little bit of time and provide some context and some narrative for you, really what the focus of requirement 11 is truly about. So if I can go ahead and get you to move forward. All right, so there are several methods that you as an organization can look to validate your compliance. Now, everybody, just as a note, everybody's required to be compliant, but depending on the type of organization you are, there might be different methods and means by which you validate that, right? So there's PCI DSS, the actual PCI DSS assessment, which is something that we do. There's also self-assessment questionnaires. And in most cases, right, these are contractually required between you and either your organization that you're working with, or if you're a merchant, between you and your processor. There are some exceptions, however, as noted here, that it's actually required by state law that if you interact with cardholder data that you do so securely and apply the PCI DSS. There's a few states that require that. All right, Sarah, if we go ahead and move forward, please. All right, so one of the first things that we need to talk about is understanding the scope of your environment, right? So if during your initial assessment, right, the first thing that we do as an organization and the first thing that we do as assessors is help to understand and identify what's considered in scope. In scope is any system that stores, processes, transmits, has the ability to provide security services, or it can impact the security of it. To paraphrase it, it's considered in scope. And just understand that those systems that are in scope, right, that within the scope of PCI, the controls that we're going to be talking about and have been talking about for some time do apply. If the assets are not in scope, if the systems are not in scope of PCI, then the things that we're talking about, I would still applaud you for doing them. They are considered best practices, but would not be a requirement to apply these controls. One of the most important things you can do is effectively identify the scope. So, if that's not done correctly, it can lead to serious issues with the ability of your organization to actually maintain the security of that assessment, or maintain the security of that environment. And is one of the most important things that we do as an organization is to help you establish the correct scope of your environment, right? But understand that as we as assessors look to do that, it's really the merchant or the service provider that we're working with that really truly owns their scope, right? We as assessors are just making sure that you've done the right things. It's really within your obligation and responsibility to define that scope for you. All right, Sarah, if we can go ahead and move forward. All right. So I've talked a little bit about this already. We're not going to spend much time here, but the scope of PCI DSS applies to people, process, and technology. We've already talked about the system components that are connected to, where we talk about no access to the CDE. We're really talking about, or the Cardholder Data Environment, we're really talking about that these systems should be segmented and that would not be considered in scope of PCI. Okay. As part of your risk management framework, I would do everything that within your ability to minimize the scope and the exposure of the data, right? So the less assets that you have that have exposure to cardholder data, the easier your job is to manage that data. Okay. So Sarah, if we can go ahead and move forward. So here we come to within control objective number 5, right? This is requirement number 11. And it's about regularly testing the security systems and processes that you have in place. And I want to spend just a few moments throughout this deck and really kind of talk about the answer.
Sure. Hey, Jeff, I think your audio is dropping.
Sorry. Can I get you to index your the slide there? All right. So really, the purpose of requirement 11 is to validate that your threat and risk management is working as it's designed and as the management and as the technical staff would expect it to. Really, when we look at, requirement 6.1 says that as an organization, you have to have a process in place for identifying vulnerabilities. You then risk rank those things and then fix them. That you're
Okay, it looks like we're having just a little bit of technical difficulties. If you just give us 1 second so we can get Jeff back on here.
Welcome to WebEx. Enter your attendee ID number, followed by pound.
Hi, this is Jeff. Is Sarah, are you there?
Yes, okay, I think we've got you back.
Okay, sorry, I had to call in using a different phone. All right, so I'll start this slide back over, and I apologize, everybody, for that. But effectively, the purpose of requirement 11 is to validate that your vulnerability identification and your vulnerability management program is effectively working. When we look at requirement 6.1, it says that you have to have a program in place for identifying vulnerabilities. So when we're using the internal scans and the external scans, it's not the purpose really is not to identify vulnerabilities, but it's to make sure that you're doing a good job around the validation that we've identified them. Typically, when I'm working with a client, I explain to them that as part of that process, you as an organization should never really be surprised by something that comes out of your internal scan, your external scans, or your vulnerability or your annual penetration test, because if you are doing those things that are required as part of requirement 6.1, these items should not be news to you, okay? So Sarah, if I can go ahead and get you to index forward, please. All right. So I want to spend a little bit of time as well, before we get into the details of this, to talk about the difference between requirement 6.6 and 11.3. When we look at requirement 6.6, and this has to do with the web application vulnerability assessments, organizations often try to present data that says, well, we've done our penetration test, and we did do a penetration test against our web application environment. Does that meet the requirement for 6.6, which is a web application security assessment? And generally speaking, that answer is typically no, it does not. These two particular requirements have different intents. And I'll talk about that in a minute. They have different intent, and they have different requirements around them. Whereas requirement 6.6, the Web Application Vulnerability Assessment, the intent and the goal behind this particular requirement is that you as an organization look to identify vulnerabilities that exist within your platform, right? And typically this is done prior to the application going into production or shortly thereafter, and then once again at least annually. You can implement the web application layer firewall as well. Most organizations use that as a means for fixing this. But understand that the penetration test that we have that's required as part of 11.3, while we are identifying vulnerabilities, really what we're testing for is to ensure that the controls that we've established within our environment are sufficient to keep the bad people out. Right, so where 6.6 is to making sure to identify the vulnerabilities, and this kind of feeds back into that requirement 6.1 that we just talked about. Requirement 11.3 is validating the controls that we have are sufficient. So if you are doing web application security assessments and using your penetration test results as a means for meeting that same piece of evidence, typically speaking, your assessor may push back and want something a little bit more, right? So understand that 6.6, it may include a penetration test, right, some of the same activities, but it goes quite a bit further. Typically with a web application security assessment, staff or the people that are running that are going to want access to the back-end systems. They're going to want access to the source code, whereas the penetration test is they're just looking at what's presented to the end users. Okay. So I just want to make sure that we understand, because we're going to be talking about penetration tests today, that the penetration test requirement does not necessarily meet the requirements for 6.6. Okay. All right, Sarah, if we can get you to go ahead and move forward. Okay. Starting off with requirement 11.1, and I'm not going to stand here and read the slides for me, but I want to just talk about what 11.1 is about. So requirement 11.1 is a requirement that we have to assess and to look at, to making sure that you as an organization have a process in place to identify if somebody has installed a wireless device into your environment that is unauthorized to be there. Now, if you say, well, Jeff, we don't have wireless devices, my typical response is, that's great. Wonderful. But what about, Hacker Joe that's, snuck into your office and installed something? So this particular assessment is not necessarily about identifying those devices that are authorized. It's about identifying devices that are not authorized. Now, the second part of this conversation that I need to have is that when you're looking for those devices that are unauthorized, we have to be able to correlate that with some list or some set of devices that is authorized. So I would ask, what happens if, as a hacker, right, I'm in your network and, I'm in your environment and I install a wireless device and I name the access point to the SID the same thing as any wireless device that you might already have. Right, chances are, if you are not looking at the MAC addresses or the BSSID, right, chances are you may not be able to effectively identify this particular item. Okay, so in terms of the means and method for identifying it, there's a couple of criteria that we have to look at. So it's not only do we have to identify the wireless access points that have been plugged into your network, but we also have to identify wireless devices that have been installed into our equipment unauthorized, or those devices such as a USB device that have been plugged in, right? And if you are looking to manage and maintain this control from just walking around with something like Wireshark, with some type of network sniffing software, NetStumbler, chances are you're only meeting part of this requirement. So one of the ways that you can meet this requirement holistically is by physical inspection. You know, I often ask if you walk around the building and you look in, you know, where network devices would be plugged in and identify those places and, you know, has anything new been installed, right? Is the things that have been installed there, are they appropriate? Are they authorized by management? Okay. If you look at the back of your computers, you can often detect whether or not we have a device that's been installed that shouldn't be there. So physical inspection is often a means by which you can meet this requirement. Okay. Let's go ahead and move forward. All right. So next as we get to requirement 11.2. Now there are 3 pieces to the requirement 11.2. The first one is that as an organization, you have a process where you're performing internal scans at least quarterly. Now, these particular scans can be performed by anybody within your organization that's qualified to do so, and that these individuals have some organizational independence. And effectively, we want to make sure that the fox isn't watching the hen house. So if it's your network administrator, if it's your database administrator, if it's your server administrator that's actually doing your internal scans, you may want to look at assigning it to somebody that doesn't have any responsibility for the management of those assets. In terms of the individual being qualified, what we look for is that the individual has the ability to run the tool. They know how to configure it and make sure that it's configured appropriately. And second, as part of that, is that this individual has the ability to export the data into something that's usable and interpret those standards and help those, or interpret the output of the scan and helping those individuals manage those vulnerabilities. Okay. So from the internal perspective, it's going to be done every 90 days. And when I want to talk about that, the PCI DSS, a lot of times organizations said, well, we scanned in Q1, we scanned in Q2, right? So, but if you look at that, if I scan at the beginning of Q1 and then again at the end of Q2, I might have gone 5 months between scans. And from this perspective, really that wouldn't meet the intent. What we're looking for is that relatively every 90 days that you're performing a vulnerability scan. Now, for the external scans, we look that you have an ASV performing your external scans. Now, the ASV is if you don't have one, that's something that we can provide for you or help you with that services. The PCI DSS Council has a list of ASVs on their website that they promote. Those scans as well need to be done relatively every 90 days. Now, anything from the external perspective that's been identified that has a CVSS score of 4.0 or higher, those things need to be addressed. Where those things are not addressed, right, then we find ourselves in a difficult situation for identifying, or we can put in a compensating control, or you can look to put in a compensating control to address those vulnerabilities. But we have to address those vulnerabilities before the next quarterly scan. Now, the next requirement is that any time that you make a significant change within your environment, you also need to perform a vulnerability scan. Now, this particular scan, whether it's internal or external, those can be performed by an internal resource, once again, that's qualified to do so and that they have organizational independence. So I often get asked the question, Jeff, what's a significant change, right? And really, it's within your organization's responsibility to define what a significant change is. If you ask me for guidance, I would tell you a significant change is any time that you modify the way that cardholder data is stored, processed, or transmitted, right? The purpose of this scan, this change scan, is that you're validating that you have not introduced any new vulnerabilities into your environment, okay? And we look, as a QSA, we look to make sure that this scan, this change scan, was done within a relatively short period of time after the implementation was done. Ideally, I like to see that it's done within a week. If we get it longer than a week, right, I get a little bit nervous about, that you're actually identifying vulnerabilities appropriately, okay? So once again, internal scans can be done by an internal resource. It can be done by a third-party QSA. Doesn't have to be. It can be done by a third-party internal resource. But note that it is something that your organization can do internally. Anything that as part of your risk ranking process back into, as we talk about requirement 6.1, anything with a risk ranking of high needs to be addressed. And then you're going to be performing new scans once that item is addressed. External scans must be done every quarter by an ASV. Anything with the CVSS score of 4 or higher needs to be addressed. And then lastly is we're going to be performing scans after any significant change to your environment. All right, sir, if we can go ahead and move forward, thank you. Now, when we get to requirement 11.3, 11.3 is focused on doing a penetration test, okay? Now, regardless of who does the penetration test for you, that individual must be qualified to do so, okay? It's not somebody that just went out and has been doing it for 10 years. You know, the length and time doesn't really matter. You know, we might look at some certifications. Having a CISSP does not qualify you to run a penetration test, right? You know, we like to see that at a minimum they have some certification such as a certified ethical hacker. There's another certification, OSCP, that we like to see as part of those individuals that are qualified to perform the test. Now, if they don't have certifications, that doesn't automatically make them disqualified to do so, but from a security perspective, for us, it's a good starting point. So you can have an internal resource to do this. You can have an external resource to do this, okay? Excuse me. So from the penetration testing perspective, right, we need to make sure that you're looking at the outside of the environment, you're out on the internet and trying to get in. When you look at the guidance that's focused on requirement 11.3, it starts out by effectively stating that the purpose and the intent behind this is that you're simulating real-world attacks. So when defining this, part of the 11.3, when we look at the requirement itself, it says that we have to have a penetration testing methodology and that methodology is based on industry best practices. There are numerous documentation frameworks out there that that you can map to. NIST has one. There are what I'd recommend is Googling or perhaps contact myself. If you do not have a penetration testing methodology, I have some primers or some templates that I can provide you to help you out with that. Okay, but we need to be testing from internal as well, right? And where these things aren't specifically identified, right, whether you're in your corporate environment and trying to get into your cardholder data environment or testing inside the cardholder data environment itself, right, that's really up for you to define what that looks like from your, within your penetration testing methodology. But to summarize that is that it needs to be done by a qualified individual. We need to look at doing the pen test from internal and external. We need to look at the networking layers, right? So you're looking at violating man-in-the-middle attacks to sniffing passwords, capturing passwords, things of that nature. We're going to be looking at the application layer, right? So we're going to be trying to get into the application to validate that the controls that you've applied are sufficient, right? So when we talk about the application layer, we're talking about the actual applications that you might be running as well as the operating system layers too, okay? If you have segmentation in place, and the purpose of the segmentation is to making sure that one part of your network or one part of your environment is out of scope. The penetration tester or the penetration test is required that you validate that is in place and effective, right? That the segmentation that you believe is there is actually functioning as required. Now, the last part of this requirement effectively says that you need to retain the results of that test for your assessor to review. So retain a copy of the original test, and then we're going to be looking where something was identified as being an issue. Then we're then going to look for the evidence that those things that were identified as part of the initial test have been resolved. Okay. So let's go ahead and move forward real quick. Now, the next requirement that we have, it looks to identify the fact that we have an IPS and an IDS in place. Now, what's interesting about this particular requirement is that it requires that you as an organization maintain your IPS, your IDS, according to the vendor's recommendation, right? And that we're also following up with this, right? So the logs that, or the events that are generated from your IPS, IDS need to be fed back into your vulnerability identification program, which is your log management, your log review, those things of that nature. So it needs to be configured and maintained according to the manufacturer's requirements and to their standards. Now, the other part of this is if you do not have a physical dedicated device, right, you can use a host-based IDS, right? That's absolutely appropriate and sufficient. But however, it needs to be appropriately configured, right? So it needs to be configured. And in terms of where we're going to be looking for the host-based IDS, the requirement says that it needs to be sitting at the perimeter of the environment, and then again at those, or the perimeter of the cardholder data environment, and then again it needs to be monitoring those systems at critical points within the CDE. You as an organization get to define what those critical points are going to be, right? That's not really for the assessor, that you get to define that, okay? So let's go ahead and move forward to our next slide, and this is our last slide. And I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time in talking about the requirements around the file integrity monitoring. Now, while most organizations have file integrity monitoring solutions in place, we find that a lot of clients struggle with getting this done correctly, okay? When we look at the requirements itself, it talks about identifying and monitoring, you know, application files, critical files, configuration files, and log files. What effectively happens is in a lot of cases, organizations will install the file integrity monitoring, and they'll install it on a Windows box or on a Linux box, and by default, it will be monitoring your System32 or your etc files, and it does a pretty good job of that. However, the file integrity monitoring solutions often don't have the cognitive ability to know and understand what you as an organization have defined as being critical system files and application executables, right? And all of those things that you have installed and functioning on that device. So really what we look for as an assessor is that you have gone in and customized your file integrity monitoring solution, making sure that the file integrity monitoring solution is monitoring your applications that you've installed into this system, and that it's monitoring the critical files, the critical executables, and those log files that might be reside on that server as well. Okay. Now, the other part of this is that you need to run the analysis at least weekly. Now, so when we look at the analysis that's being run, I would take you back and ask the question, you know, generally speaking, what happens the second Tuesday of every month? And really, if you remember, Microsoft has a process where they patch on the second Tuesday of every month. So the next time you run your file integrity monitoring solution, right, often you'll see an incredible amount of changes that have occurred. What we find in a lot of cases is that where we see all of these alerts and people just automatically say, well, these particular events happened because of Patch Tuesday, I don't know that that's necessarily an appropriate position to look at, right, or to take. Because an attacker, if they know that you run your file integrity monitoring on Wednesday and Thursday you're going to be reviewing it, right, they're going to do that the second week of the month, right, because they know that what they've done might get hidden by the noise of the patching, right? So effectively, you need to be following up with your exceptions. And as an assessor, right? As an assessor, we look to making sure that you've actually identified the file integrity monitoring, the events, and that you're following up to those noted exceptions, okay? So let's go ahead and move forward, and I think that actually concludes this particular section. I want to just, as a conclusion, remember that requirement 11 is about validating that your program is functioning correctly. You need to be scanning every 90 days. Even if you have this outsourced to a third party, do not rely on that third party to be the one to execute those scans for you. You own that process. Please make sure that if you've outsourced it, that they're doing the internal scanning and that your ASB scanning is done according to schedule. A lot of times what we see happen is companies forget to reach out to their ASB to have that occur, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and move forward. So Sarah, I want to go ahead and turn this back over to you. I want to say thank you to everybody for attending the webinar today and open the floor for any questions and answers that might be there. So Sarah?
Okay. I would like to encourage everyone, if you do have questions, to go on and submit those at this time. Really quickly, just to give you a heads up, sometime next month we will be concluding the 12 requirements with PCI Readiness Series Requirement 12. So be on the lookout for those invitations in your inbox. And I'm not seeing any questions, Jeff, so unless you had any other points that you needed to make, we can give everyone the rest of the hour back.
No, I think that that's it. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you everybody for spending part of your day with me. Okay. Have a good day.
Thank you.